Is it Celtic? Welcome everyone. In this week's free community class, we are going to be exploring the topic of, is this Celtic? And by this, I mean what I talk about: plant spirit work, herbalism, herbal magic, working with the plants as persons in a magical ritual context. Is it Celtic? It may not surprise you too much to know that I am of European stock, of European ancestry, far removed, but still, that's the greatest point of my ancestry happened in northern and western Europe, and so it's clear that I bring a lot of the lore, a lot of the plant lore, especially, and a lot of the animist thinking, the animist viewpoints and perspectives, that the ones that I've been able to discover anyway, from my deep ancestors into my practice, as a way to not only honor my deep ancestors, but as a way to not reinvent the wheel, right? These practices have been being done across time and place since the beginningless beginning, and while they have to be altered slightly in order to be relevant in the here and now, there's no real reason to draw them up from scratch again. In a lot of cases, we can look to the extant lore of whatever our particular ancestry is and find ways to bring that wisdom into our lives, even if we're not living in the same place and we're, many generations removed from those people. The power of that lore, of that wisdom, of those experiences still very much move through our blood. So I think that it's realistic that there are people who assume that what I teach is some kind of Celtic plant spirit work or a Celtic way of doing things, and that is not the case. So what's happening behind the scenes is this: most of what I present, most of what I share, most of what I do, I have learned directly through my involvement with plant spirits. I have put in years and years and years of work, of dedication, of devotion, of study, of experimentation, of stewardship to gain plant spirit allies, plant spirit familiars who have become teachers, mentors, guardians, and guides for me. And so most of what I present comes directly from their world to here. Now, we're all going to see reflexes of this in our particular culture's expression of plant spirit work, because the plants have been teaching everybody since the beginning. So it doesn't matter what tradition of plant spirit work you look at, you're going to see similarities, and you're just going to see threads that run through them all, which to me is very, very cool, very edifying. But for me personally, I center the direct teachings of the plants and their guardians because of my particular situation, that I was not born into a culture with an active plant spirit tradition. I am part of an ancestry where the plant spirit traditions that existed are either lost or, heavily Christianized and manipulated, or have been just sort of relegated to the realm of fairy tales, which we can still extract a great deal of information from, but it's not easy. And this is something that lots of different people experience for lots of different ways. So for me, embodying, kind of catching the wisdom where and when I am is very important, because it speaks to who I am as a person, where I live, where I was born, the land that I'm interacting with and trying to be in right relationship with. And it allows me to do this work without trying to be somebody I'm not. And I think this is like the big point of all of this for me is when people who are, descendants of or of a particular ancestry, for example, I'll use myself an example, because I am of Celtic ancestry, whatever that means at this point, right? Like that word isn't even particularly accurate anymore, because it implies some kind of homogenization of very, very distinct cultures that really don't oftentimes match together. It might be easier to go further back and say of Proto-Indo-European descent, but even that is a very messy topic. What happens is when we try to align ourselves that way as people who don't live on those ancestral lands, don't speak those ancestral languages, we're many generations removed, and the culture itself is no longer the way that it was when, during the time that we're kind of romanticizing it. We're sort of forcing ourselves to be somebody we're not. We're forcing ourselves into a mold that probably doesn't work for who, when, and where we are. And what I see is people find this spiritual tension, right? At first, it's very liberating. It gives people a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, and that's all great. And you can keep all of that to a certain degree. But then what happens is people are trying to take these practices that worked 2,000, 3,000 years ago in a very specific place at a very specific time and put them into the middle of the city in 2022 in America where they live. And it doesn't always feel right. It doesn't always feel the same. Sometimes those practices are inappropriate, for who we are as a people now, or illegal, right? So for me, part of the beauty of sorcery is that it is incredibly adaptogenic, that like adaptogen herbs, it adjusts itself to meet the needs of time and place, that it shows up and unfolds in a way that is relevant to when, where, and who it is unfolding in. And the reality is that while we should hold the lore, the traditions, the teachings of our ancestors tightly in one hand, we should also have an open hand to receive direct teachings from the non-human persons, from our spiritual allies who are here right now, who are actively present and teaching now. Because ultimately, everything that is lore now was at one time novel, right? No matter how old, how ancient, at one point, it was the first time somebody told that story. It was the first time somebody received that teaching from a deity or a hero or a plant spirit or an animal spirit or a spirit of place. And it was the first time that was spoken in the way that it was spoken. And it rang true. And so people continued to speak it and continued to hand it on until it became lore, until it became legend, right? And so we are privileged in a way that we can hold whatever it is from our various ancestral traditions that we can find that speaks to our work. We can hold that in one hand while grabbing always to have new teachings come through that speak to where we are right now and who we are right now, the gnosis, right? So it's that balancing of lore and gnosis that sort of somewhere between those two things is the truth. Each of them is a fact in its own right, and then you combine them to get the truth of things. So what I do, what I teach, no, it's not Celtic. Is it inspired by my Celtic ancestors? Absolutely. I think it would be impossible for me to do otherwise because their voices resound in my work. They speak to me in ritual, meditation, and dream. They inspire me in so many of the ways that I walk. I pray to them and call to them to continue to teach me the things that they know that have either been lost or taken with them or didn't make it from there to here. And so it's absolutely in there, but I am through and through a devotee of the plant spirits. Whether I was living in Wales or Amsterdam or America, I will always be seeking out relationships with the plants who show up there and honoring them and learning from them and working with them in magic and medicine and ritual. So is it Celtic? No. What is it? I don't know. Relevant. This is why over the past few years I have really leaned into loving the term sorcery, because it allows me to differentiate what I do from contemporary forms of witchcraft, which is also not what I do. And it allows me to lean into an idea that everything that I do, everything that I talk about, everything that I find importance in is based in relationships. And that could be my relationships to my deep ancestors, my relationships to lore, to the lore and plant lore that's been handed down. But more often than not, it is based in the relationships of the present that I work very hard to maintain and nourish. The trust and the openness that I try to cultivate with my plant spirit allies. And so sorcery as a term, meaning an exploration and an embodiment of the reality of spirits, a trafficking of spirits, is a more appropriate term, and one that takes cultural limitations away from the practice. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. What I mean is that it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, or when you are. You can take these practices, these ideas, these ways of communicating with plant spirits, learning from them, protecting them, stewarding them, being in relationship with the land, being in service of the people who have a ancient ancestral connection to the land that you're living on, all of that without it needing to be Celtic for it to be okay for you to do, right? Because this is just relationship. It's just you showing up in the place where you are in a way that at the end of the day makes you more responsible, makes you more invested in how nature is being cared for and how the various non-human spirits of place are being honored as persons. When we do this work, we become fierce protectors of the wild. And I think if everyone was doing that, at least to some degree, we would be in a much better place than we are now. Had our origins of animistic perspective that all humans at one point shared not been erased or manipulated by the powers that be, I really believe the world would be in a much different place than it is now. We have what we have, so we have to work with what we have, and part of that is this resurgence in embracing animism, this term animism that we're seeing right now, even among traditions that have been historically non-animistic. So that's interesting. So plant spirit work is about relationships. It's about you showing up in your own garden, your own parks, the wild spaces around you, being in direct personal relationship with the plant spirits and their guardians who show up there, learning directly from them, working with the plant spirits who show up where you are, not exoticizing or fetishizing plants from across the pond or across the world, or those that are sacred parts of other people's plant medicine practices, having a respect for those plants and even being in relationship with them, but not fetishizing them. It is you being authentically who you are so that you can be in an authentic relationship with who the plant spirits authentically are. And that is the base of all sorcery. That is the base of all plant spirit work. It doesn't matter which culture, which tradition, which path of plant spirit work you look at. At the end, you will come away from learning whatever you learn saying, oh, it's all about the human person doing the work and being in relationship with the plants. So embrace your ancestral heritage, call on your ancestors, call in the lore that has survived from wherever your ancestors are from into your own practices as much as makes sense. Let it settle in a way that makes sense for you, but do not close your ears or any of your other senses for that matter to what is being taught to you right here and right now. The world has gone through so many incredible shifts and changes and movements, syncretizations, colonizations, co-opting, that I personally think, and the plants consistently teach, that the answer is in just direct reconnection to nature. So That is not to say that we're tossing off the past and ignoring what our ancestors did and said. It just means that we're finding a healthy balance between what was done and what is being done, right? What was said and what is being said, what was taught and what is currently being taught. So hopefully that gives you some insight, some perspective, and some things to think about. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your experiences on this. Again, I know this is not a topic that's comfortable for a lot of people, but it's an important one to talk about. And I know that my perspective on this is probably not going to be everybody's cup of tea, and that's okay too. But I would love to learn from you and your particular perspective. So share them in the comments. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.